roll the roll and go. Where am I to go? Meet Johnny, where am I to go? For I'm a young and a sailor lad, and where am I to go?
Welcome to Where Am I to Go podcast. I am so grateful you have chosen to listen to me and to go on the travels and see the things and go to the museums that we have managed to go through for the last 2 seasons. I have really enjoyed doing this podcast, and I hope you stick with me. It makes me happy to know that people are enjoying what I do. On another note, I want to make sure that everybody knows that we are on Facebook at Where Am I to Go podcast. We have lots of pictures. We have places that we go that we don't do podcasts on. And we have lots of things to see and think about when you decide you're going to travel or if you're just interested in learning about different places that we go. Also, we have an email account at whereamitigopodcast@gmail.com. And if anybody has any comments, ideas, thoughts, you are more than welcome to email me there, and I will do my best to answer. And we'll see where everything goes this season. I've got some neat things lined up, and I hope everybody is ready to go for a museum tour ride. Today we're at a museum that I have always really enjoyed. It's in Butte, Montana, and Butte, Montana is a pretty cool old place. From my understanding, it was settled by Irish, or the Irish came here to work in droves in the mine. We are at the World Museum of Mining here. We are with Christopher, and we are going to have a heck of a time. Hello, Christopher. Welcome to Where Am I to Go?
Hi, how are you doing?
Good. How about you?
I'm doing all right today.
I'm glad that you're doing all right today.
Yeah.
Maybe tomorrow, too.
Yeah, hopefully. So Butte is a really cool place for a number of reasons. And you're not wrong about the Irish. We do have a very large Irish population here, but that was just one of the many groups that did come settle in Butte. We had people from 37 different countries around the world come here and work in the mines. Most of them did return to their places of origin. They came here, worked, and either went home or moved to other places in the country. And so the Irish did happen to stick around. And from what I've been told, Butte does have the most people with Irish descent in the United States in per capita. So even
Really?
Boston can't claim that over us. And we do have more Gaelic speakers than even Ireland does.
Really?
That's what I've been told. Don't quote me on it.
No, you've been quoted.
I know I've been quoted. But no, I've been told that's the case. And it wouldn't surprise me if that is true because Gaelic is a dying language. And so there's not a lot of speakers of it to begin with anymore. So given the popularity of Ireland amongst people from Butte, it wouldn't be surprising at all that be the case. We do have a lot of older folks here that love that heritage and exploring that heritage, and that includes the languages itself.
Cool. Do you guys have a St. Patty's Day party?
Yeah. So I don't know that we don't have a river to dye green like Chicago, but Butte goes pretty hard for St. Patrick's Day. In fact, we also have a halfway to St. Patrick's Day celebration here in Butte. So we don't just celebrate St. Patrick's Day, we celebrate the 6-month mark on the way to St. Patrick's Day.
Great.
Now, is that when they start sobering up, or is that when they start drinking again?
That's a wonderful question. And I have to say, I don't know that technically they would be sober. They just start drinking again. Maybe they've had their cup of coffee, but it's probably got some whiskey in it anyways.
I've always heard that Butte's the place to be on St. Patty's Day, and I have not had the opportunity or have not taken the opportunity to be here, but I hear it's quite the...
The whole town comes out for it. All 30,000 people are on the streets partying hard. It's a big thing here. It's a very, very heavily celebrated tradition in Butte.
Cool.
Yeah.
Now, I know that a lot of Montanans refer to Butte as, well, they take the E off the end and refer to it as kind of the Butte of Montana. I've heard that an awful lot. But, I have always been highly intrigued with Butte. The architecture here, the buildings, and that type of stuff are just phenomenal. I mean, they were all built in the late 18. A lot of them were built in the late 1800s. And when you drive up Montana Avenue and see some of the old buildings and the restorations and stuff, this is a beautiful town. I mean, Butte is really a beautiful place.
It really is,
despite its reputation.
Yeah, well, and we may have a reputation for being a little wild, but Butte was one of the premier cities of Montana and of the United States in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And maybe that's why the rest of Montana calls us Butte, because they're a little jealous of what Butte had to offer. But the architecture that you bring that up, I've been told by a guy who's from Dublin, Ireland. He came and did a tour last year. And he told me that he noticed a lot of our architecture in Uptown is very similar to what you would find in Dublin. And he thinks, and I think I agree with him, is that in that point in time is when we were getting a lot of those Irish immigrants coming in. And,
right.
you know, some of our Copper Kings, William Clark and Marcus Daly, both Irishmen. We had quite a few big prominent Irishmen that came to Butte. And so the architecture kind of took on the style that was popular in Ireland at the time. And so he said to me, this feels like I'm walking down the streets of Dublin right now, not a city in America. And this is a guy from Ireland who said it. So to me, that says, you know, a lot of the architecture was influenced by that big influx of Irish immigrants coming in and working the mines and being the guys who built and designed all the buildings around here. And one of the things that is important to the city is preserving that history and keeping those buildings intact and honoring that history, while also trying to bring them up to speed so that we can have more businesses come into Butte, more people come visit and see that history. But we don't want to lose it by just tearing buildings down all the time. They do try to make sure we really preserve that architecture.
I would say that they're doing a very nice job of that. And like I said, over the many years that I've driven through Butte and been around here, the mountains around here are beautiful. You've got so much outdoor recreation that can happen around here, as well as the town is just such a cool old town.
It is, and there's lots and lots of history here. You know, one of the things that Butte has a claim to that no one else can is that we were the first fully electrified city west of the Mississippi.
Wow.
And that was before New York City, San Francisco, and Los Angeles.
Really?
So all three of those big cities, you know, it took them years to get fully electrified, whereas Butte, even in its heyday when we were 100,000 people, already fully electrified, had electricity. We were working with arc lights before Edison even released his incandescent bulbs. We had the arc lights being installed in mines here in Butte to work and bring up to speed that electricity. Part of the main reason that happened, the copper was coming from Butte.
Right. Okay.
And contrary to popular belief, we were into the copper pretty much immediately. And so the first prospectors showed up in 1864 looking for gold. That's most people at that time. You know, those prospectors that were traveling around the country, coming from places like, you know, Virginia City, Nevada, the gold camps in California. They were looking for that next big hit on the placer mines, just the panning for gold and stuff. And they weren't interested in working in those underground. They wanted the quick, easy buck, so to speak. So they showed up in 1864, and a group of them that did show up immediately noticed that there were areas where there was gold, but there was also a lot of copper and silver. And so they were interested in working that copper from the beginning. However, to work copper mines, you got to go underground. You can't really, you can, now we have the big open pit mines where you're technically stripping all that stuff off and mining the surface and just taking everything. But back then, if you wanted to go for copper, you were going to have to process it, and it's going to cost money, a lot of money. And so what happened was these guys saw the value in the minerals that were here, but they didn't have the funds to invest into really going into those. Some guys did try, so we have some gentlemen like William Parks and Joseph Ramsdale who would claim the Parrot Lode in October of 1864 alongside the original Ngonian mines that were also first claimed in that year. They, by 1866, had built a smelter to smelt the copper. They didn't fail. They actually did succeed in smelting the copper and shipped it both to Baltimore, Maryland, and to Swansea, Wales, two of the major copper production areas at that time. And they made some good profit off of it, but it wasn't financially viable for them to continue operating the smelter the way that they were. They were using horsepower. So literally they set up an engine working off of horses, and it was too inconsistent because the horses could walk, but when they took a break, the metal would cool, and so that it was hindering the process of smelting. And so they did get an electric engine installed or a steam engine installed, but it just wasn't cost effective. And so it wouldn't be until the 1870s when William Clark finished his custom smelter that the Colorado and Boston Smelting Company helped him build here in Montana. And that would be the Colorado and Montana Smelting Company. And his smelter was the one that really started the process of getting into the silver and the copper boom that everyone talks about in the 1870s and 80s. But realistically speaking, Butte was into the copper right away. We have some newspaper articles that I found that talk about the correspondents write to their newspapers talking about the futures of the Butte area, and they specifically mentioned how the copper veins are going to be more valuable and really shine even bigger than the gold and silver being found. And that wasn't to say that there weren't a lot of gold and silver coming out of the ground here, just they knew even back then that copper was going to be the big thing for Butte.
Well, and I did a podcast at the Ely Railroad Museum where the curator there was telling us about the copper coming out of the ground, and he referred to it as a copper revolution, that they couldn't get enough copper back in those days because they were starting to run the electric lines and they were starting to do all of the technology stuff that was coming around at the turn of the century, and everything needed copper.
And so even adding to that, before electricity came out, a good amount of technology was still based on copper in the sense that steam engines, all of that stuff, all used brass for its parts, and brass is an alloy of copper, so you can't make brass without copper. And even before brass, bronze was also a major industry here in the United States. Our first official copper rolling mill in the United States was actually opened by Paul Revere.
Really?
Yes. After in right at the turn of the century, he actually rolled his first sheets from that factory in 1801. But he was our first copper entrepreneur in the United States, and he basically started his company to make sheets, copper sheets that they used to sheathe the bottom of our ships in our Navy.
Okay.
And his industry, his ability to actually become an entrepreneur, because the British, they banned exports of their copper sheets to the United States.
Imagine that.
Yeah, they didn't want us to have the same advantages, and so the United States was then forced to come up with its own industry to counter that. Before that, we had a big brass industry here, but not really a copper industry, because the major copper industrial area of that time was Swansea, Wales, and Cornwall. It was being mined in Cornwall, taken to Swansea and processed, and then shipped around the world. And then as the United States was forced to start producing its own copper, we started slowly taking over that dominance of the copper industry. And by the mid-1800s, we were pretty much right on par with England. And then by the late 1800s, we had taken over the copper. We were producing, the U.S. was producing upwards of 40 to 50% of the world's copper at that point.
Really?
And a good portion of that was coming from Butte. So in 1906, specifically, Butte produced 20.6% of the entire world's copper supply.
Butte.
1/5 of the entire copper supply of the world came from this city.
That's amazing.
It's incredible.
Okay, now a question I have is Anaconda, another 30 miles down the road,
Yes.
has a great big smokestack still there.
Yep.
That was your smelter point, is that correct?
Starting in the late 1800s, after that was built, it became the focal point of our smelting and refining operations. In the 1890s, 4 out of Butte's five smelters, so the smelters located in the city, closed.
Okay.
And we had one smelter that would stay operating until the 1930s, and then after 1930, everything was being processed in Anaconda or up in Great Falls, where Anaconda had its other smelters and its other smelting operations. And so part of that came from the company Anaconda, which was founded by Marcus Daly back in the 1880s. In 1881, I believe, is when he actually put the company into existence, and he purchased the Anaconda mine to start mining silver and copper. He had realized the advantages of buying that mine, and he had inspected other mines around and knew that there was a pretty big copper vein down there. He didn't anticipate the size of it. When they actually found the Anaconda lode, that's what really blew up the copper boom here. Their other copper mines were operating at that time, but it was that Anaconda lode that just blew things up. And he founded the city of Anaconda in order to process his ores, because other than Silverbow Creek, we didn't have a lot of water here in Butte. We were a pretty dry area, which was another issue they encountered in the early days with placer mining and stuff like that. And so he went over and built it where he knew there was a water source. And he strategically just kept purchasing and falling into the ownership of multiple mines. And then he partnered with with John D. Rockefeller's brother, William Rockefeller, and Henry Rogers of Standard Oil to form Amalgamated Copper, which owned Anaconda. And they just started buying up basically everything they could get their hands on here in Butte. And so as they became the primary and dominant company, everything was getting shipped over to Anaconda to be processed in their factories and their smelters. And as they continued to build up that city, they basically built every industry there that they needed to support their mining. So they had bricks works, they had iron works, everything they needed to supply the mines here in Butte was made over there in Anaconda or up in Great Falls.
Okay.
And
Anaconda's a neat little town, too. When you go through Anaconda, you see the big smelter, or the big smokestack.
Which is the largest freestanding brick structure in the world.
Really?
It is.
Well, you can see it from 50 miles either direction.
You can actually drive a car around the top of the stack.
Oh, really?
Yeah, that's how big it is.
Wow.
And you can fit the Washington Monument inside of it.
Really?
Yes.
I had no idea.
It's incredible.
But I know that when you drive through town, you see a lot of the old crucibles sitting on, all through town where they melted the iron or the copper or whatever in the big crucibles and some of that. It's just kind of a neat place.
Yeah, and a lot of the stuff that was in those factories and stuff, basically when the companies were shutting stuff down, the guys working there grabbed what they could. The rest of it got buried.
Now, this museum, like I said, is really cool. It's massive. Is about the only way to describe it. We're going to hit a few of the high points here with Christopher and take a look at some of the different things. But you guys have basically a village set up back here with 35 or 40 houses that all have different aspects of the mining or of the town and of the mining operation displayed.
So what it is Hellroaring Gulch is what we call our replica mine town, and it was built to kind of show people what Butte looked like in the late 1800s, so around the 1890s, the room we're standing in right now, this is our Sammy Keith doll collection, and actually a lot of these doll houses you see right here, if you take a close look, you'll notice that they resemble some of the buildings out in Hellroaring Gulch, and that's because these helped kind of inspire the idea and concept behind Hellroaring Gulch, which, again, it's our replica mine town, and so we have quite a few interesting exhibits out here. I definitely have my favorites. But the really cool ones, the ones that we have some really good artifacts in, we have the First National Bank, which is supposed to be a replica of the First National Bank, which was founded by Andrew Jackson Davis. He was one of our early pioneers here in Butte and Montana's first millionaire. And so this is designed to look like the first national bank that was located here in Butte. It's not a perfect replica, but it does a pretty good job of actually showcasing it. And we have lots of cool stuff in there, which we do offer some behind the scenes tours. Once a month, we do take people into the exhibit. Some of the exhibits we kind of each month do different ones, and the bank is one of those exhibits that we've gone into before, and it's pretty cool because we call it our white glove tour, and we give you a pair of cotton white gloves, and we let you pick up artifacts. Stuff
that is
like
cool.
That. It's a very cool.
And
experience.
when is that like?
Our next one will be on August 25th, and we'll be going into the post office, the Pioneers cabin on the other side, the Chinese laundry building that we have, and the Durant Railroad Station.
Wow. And so you do those every month?
We do them. This year we kind of did a select, so we started in May, and we're ending with this one in August. But the intention is to start offering those regularly. This was kind of our test run to see if people would actually sign up for them. They've tried it in the past and haven't had the best success with it, but this year I've had half or full. We're only offering 6 spots on the tour just because a lot of our exhibits, getting more than 6 or 7 people in there can be a little tight.
And so how do you schedule these online or
so yeah, you can
call
book
the
them through
museum,
the web. You can book them throh the website online.
And what's your website? Just
It's
we'll try and mention it a couple of times.
Okay, it's miningmuseum.org is our website, and that you can book general admission, underground tours, the white glove tours when we're offering them, any tours that or events that are for, admissions will be available through those sites. We also have some ghost hunts that we're helping to do here at the museum that are available through the site as well, which is something we're doing more regularly is paranormal stuff. I don't.
That seems to be really popular.
It is
right now.
And Butte seems to have a lot of it going on, and it seems to be very popular with people. That's a little outside of my personal realm. Just I'm more interested in the stories, I guess, than the ghosts.
Right.
But, it is pretty cool experiences, though. From what I've told, people have a great time. They really enjoy it. They're done very well. But all of that, like I said, is through the website. But the white glove tours, that's run by me as the curator. I take those, and we intend to have more than just me doing them. But for now, that's kind of the test run, was to see how it would go. And it's been a very cool experience. We've gotten to go through and show people, instead of just looking through the windows, you can actually look at the artifacts and see them a little bit better. So it offers a really cool experience, and it's not that much more expensive than taking our underground tour. The white glove tour is $25 a person, so it's just $4 more, and that's across the board, $25. So it's, I believe 12 and up is what our limit is for age, and that's only because, given that we're handling some artifacts that are pretty old, we just don't want to take the risk of somebody dropping one and anything like that.
Cool. And your underground tours, you do those every day?
We do those every day. We do recommend booking them ahead of time, usually, especially between
I just bought the last 3 tickets at 10 o'clock this morning.
Yep, and so there you go. We usually, by noon, every ticket is sold. And we have days in the peak season where when we get here to work at 9:30 before we open up, every spot is already sold, and we haven't even opened yet.
And the underground tour takes you what, 100 feet, 200 feet?
100 feet down underground, so it's taking you down to the 100-foot station of the Orphan Girl mine, and that 100-foot station is quite old. We believe it was started sometime about 1921, so it's a little over 100 years old now. It's very well maintained. It's an hour-and-a-half tour that takes about 30 minutes on the surface, and then an hour to an hour and 5 minutes or so underground. Kind of depends on how the group's moving and everything like that, but we typically try to do about 30 minutes on the surface and an hour underground. And the underground portion, you get a hard hat when you start the tour. You've got to wear a hard hat underground. You get lights. A lot of the mine that you're going to be walking through going down was all tunneled and built by volunteer miners that all worked in the mines here in Butte, and were a big part of getting the museum started. and they helped build the drifts that you'll be walking down to get to that 100-foot station. But the 100-foot station down there is part of the original workings.
Cool. I'm excited about getting to do that.
It's a very cool experience. I love going down there. When I do tours, it's always a fun time. I have a great time with my tour groups.
Good.
My problem is I talk too much.
Oh, really?
So, yeah, because I can I can run out of. I start looking at my clock and I'm like, oh, we're supposed to be underground and we still got some things to talk about.
Yeah.
So
I have that problem too, to be right honest with you. But yeah, so this is set up, you said, as like what Hell Roaring Gulch would be set up.
So and the name Hell Roaring Gulch actually comes. So it's funny you mentioned Evel Knievel earlier before we started, because Evel Knievel there was a competition and a little girl won, and her prize was supposed to be getting to meet and hang out with Evel Knievel.
Okay.
Evel Knievel didn't show up.
He forgot?
I don't know. He may have forgotten. Maybe he had drank a little too much the night before. I'm not sure. Maybe he was partying hard like he always did, but he didn't show up to the event. And so the consolation prize instead was to name our little town here.
Oh, okay.
And so she named it Hell Roaring Gulch. And the actual city was always known as Butte, and before it was incorporated as Butte, it was known as Butte City. And actually the person who came up with that name, his name is Dr. Anson Ford, and he was one of the original pioneers here. He's one of the first few guys to show up. And the story is that he named it after Big Butte, and I found an article that actually quotes the whole thing, and the guy that was with him was Thomas Porter, and he said he wasn't sure if he was talking about Big Butte, Little Butte, or Timber Butte. And it could have been any of the three, but given what Dr. Ford's quoted as saying, I think he was talking about Big Butte, because he said it's our biggest landscape. I'm thinking of the word here. I'm not gonna think of the word.
Landmark.
Thank you very much.
Boy, I was taxing mine too.
My brain sometimes gets a little too fast and I can't. But it was our most prominent landmark in the area, and said, well, we should name it Butte, boys. And if it hadn't been named Butte, it was going to be named after another city from back where all these guys were from, like Ohio or Pennsylvania or something. So I'm kind of glad that Dr. Anson Ford stood up and said, no, let's name it Butte.
Yeah.
And it's a little bit of a unique name. Pretty cool little little story.
Well, let's take a quick walk around
Right.
and talk about some of the different displays and stuff. I know when I was here before, you had one on some of the different fraternal groups, and some of that. I found that one highly interesting.
So we've got two exhibits that talk about two different organizations. We have the Knights of Pythias, which is a fraternal organization that does a lot of community work. They are still around today. They're an international organization. They're probably not quite as big as they used to be, but they're still going pretty strong, still donating lots of money to charities and trying to help people out where they can. And then next to them, on the other side, we have the Ancient Order of the Hibernians, another fraternal order. That one, you have to be Catholic and Irish to be a part of. That is, or of Irish descent, I should say. But those are two of the big requirements to be. But their organization, again, also very good about helping the community out. They don't restrict themselves just to helping Catholics anymore. That's what the organization started out as, was to help the Irish Catholics. But it has evolved, and they're a good fraternal order that does look out for the communities that they're based in, and they do a lot of good work.
Most of these are just look through the window situations, unless you're on the white glove tour.
Yeah, and we have a few exhibits that do have openings that you can step into and see a little bit better. But the reason we have the exhibit set up this way is to protect the artifacts more than anything. I would love to let people just wander through, but then artifacts would go missing or get broken fairly easily, I think. So the white glove tour is kind of our way of offering that opportunity to really get a close-up, hands-on look at some of the really cool stuff we have here.
And as we came down this first street, you had a schoolhouse. You've got the St. James Hospital, City Hall, the Knights of Pythias.
Zubik's art studio, which is his photography studio, is one of our photographers here.
Okay.
And then our print shop, which is actually, so it hasn't operated in a few years, but we used to print all of our own materials.
Oh, really?
Here at the museum. Yeah, we had a.
So you were actually using the print shop
We did, yeah. We had a gentleman who could run it, and we're working on potentially getting myself and another employee here trained to run the print shop again, so we can start offering some different things and running the machines again.
And are you going to set all the print type and everything?
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, geez, you're going to have a full-time job. Forget the one you've got going right now. I can't even imagine having seen some of these different printing presses
it's
from the old days,
stuff.
having to sit there and write it all out on the little print. What are they? They're forms.
They have the little. They're usually made out of lead. The little
Right.
type letters that you could set, or they used to use wood blocks that they would carve,
Right.
and all that to print, and
then you'd press the paper onto the
Yep.
ink. That's why it was called a printing press.
Yeah, you'd have to.
Yeah, just amazing to think. And you got to set them all upside down too, don't you?
Yes, I believe so. It's all backwards so that you can print it. It's a pretty incredible process. And
Yeah.
actually, speaking about that is just the history, just a little history knowledge. The first movable type was actually made on porcelain, and then the most popular movable type before Gutenberg produced his Bible was actually made out of copper and bronze.
Okay.
And the oldest known movable type comes from China and Korea, and there's a Korean Buddhist text that was printed with bronze movable type about 76 years before Gutenberg printed his Bible with his press. So that's just one of those little things. I always find it interesting when you find stuff like that, where for the most people think Gutenberg's Bible was the first printed with movable type, and actually it wasn't the first printed with movable type.
Now they've got a copy of a Gutenberg press at the Computer Museum in
over
Bozeman.
Yes,
yeah,
I've been
and it
over
was
there.
pretty fascinating. We did a podcast there also.
Okay, cool. Yeah. That's
Yeah.
a very cool little museum. We've been there. I've been there once, but we really enjoyed it over there. I like the stuff they have.
Yeah, and then we turned the corner here and we hit
The Undertakers.
The Undertakers.
And that's the Hibernian Hall.
Hibernia.
So
Boy, I'm glad you said that word because I was going to mess it up all kinds of ways. And then we got Victoria's rooms with a Victoria looking out one of the windows. And we're ready to turn on to the next little street here,
Yeah,
and we have the jail.
The jail is the / marshal's office. This is kind of our little main street here in the town. So we have our drugstore, which the drugstore is kind of a mix of what you would see in the late 1800s and a little bit of earlier or a little bit later, like 1920s, 30s, because we do have a soda fountain bar in here.
Okay.
And that obviously probably not in this type of style been there in the 1800s, but it's actually one of the old soda fountain bars from town, so we kind of couldn't not do it.
Right. Well, of course.
Honor that
it's still history. 1920 still history.
Exactly. And so we have our assayer's office, which the assayer's the guy who, if you were pulling some ore out of the ground, you'd take it to him, and he would take it and crush it up and check it out chemically and see what your actual contents of, gold or silver or copper was.
Per tonnage and
and
quality.
And they would take a few pieces of ore from let's say you brought out a mine car full of ore. They'd take one or two pieces of that ore, assay it, and that would give you a pretty good estimate of what your quality of ore was. So your percentile being, if it's assaying at 45% copper, as an example, or versus 60 or 70 or less, in the 20s. And so that guy, the assayer, was probably one of the more important people in a mining camp, in the sense that he kind of helped set the prices of the materials. And
he was probably the richest guy in town too, as it came off on his clothes and ended up in his pockets and some of that kind of stuff.
I wouldn't doubt it. That's probably why a lot of companies started employing their own assayers.
Why? So that they could still get rich, because the company wouldn't have any idea what was going in his pocket either.
That's probably true. We have our general store, of course. The general store over there would be your basic. The general store, almost what you would think of as like Walmart today. It's
Right.
a place where you can get almost anything you need.
And again,
so-
it was kind of a service center. I know
Yeah,
I've noticed going through so many of these different museums, they had the counter with the scale on it and the bins, and the grocer, the man that was running it, because I think it was mostly men doing
Yeah.
this stuff back in the day. He would dish up, you say you want 5 pounds of flour. He would dish it up, put it in the bag, and send you out the door with it, versus you going and looking on all the shelves at the canned goods.
Yep, it was definitely a full service store, and you're not wrong as far as men being the prominent. Part of that is your typical mining camp. You had 20 men for every woman. So there weren't a lot of women in the mining camps for a number of reasons. Part of it being it was a very hard life going out into the West and living in those mining towns, and most women didn't want to do that. It
Right.
wasn't even that it was not that they couldn't; they just chose not to. Plenty
And
of
the
stories.
towns were pretty rough too. I think that
And
the towns a lot of times were a pretty rough place to
They
raise
were.
a family.
Yeah, and that's definitely, it wouldn't be typically until you saw big industry coming into towns where then you would start to see families moving in. And that's the same for Butte. It wasn't until the 1870s when the big money was starting to flow into Butte and the more industrial side of mining was showing up, then guys would start moving their families to Butte instead of just coming by themselves and working and sending that money back home. Because living in the West was dangerous. It wasn't
Right.
an easy life, not just because of the work you were doing, but because of the people you were around. I mean, territories, for example, Montana wasn't a state yet when Butte got started. It was a territory. The territories were where bad guys went to hide. That was places they could escape, most of the law.
Right.
And we have plenty of stories of guys like, Wild Bill Hickok, Bat Masterson, guys,
Just all the outlaws
those-
outlaws and in-laws. I mean, the in-laws were just as bad as the outlaws
exactly,
in those
and
days.
those guys, they're more akin to bounty hunters than the law or
Right.
sheriffs. But those guys there was a reason those stories became famous, and Butte has plenty of those stories too, of guys that the rough and tumble crowd and things like that. But Butte also didn't take too kind, like not just Butte, but Montanans in a whole. They didn't take too kindly to the criminal element, so they did start kind of pushing that stuff away as quick as they could because they were more interested in
Making a living.
and actually settling down and raising a family. And so that's why Montana has so many good ranches, good ranching communities, good mining communities, because people banded together and realized it's a lot better to work as a team and team effort to take care of each other and survive than it is to have people constantly shooting each other in the street, stuff like that.
Now you've got an optical parlor here.
Yes.
And was eyewear kind of prominent in the late 1800s, mid 1800s? I know Benjamin Franklin, I guess, had a pair of glasses.
Yeah. So I believe Benjamin Franklin is actually responsible for inventing the bifocals, as we know them today.
So then they must have had opticals long time before him too then.
Yeah, and so from what I've been able to research, we have pretty much evidence going back to like Greece and Rome and Egypt of them attempting not necessarily glasses as we think of them, but making magnifying devices so they could see better. Because eyesight has been bad eyesight has been a problem with humans for a very long time. It's not just the TVs and video games doing it to us like they like to tell us.
Right. Well, this is the thing that's interesting about this too is as we're talking about these different places like the optical center, the barber shop and bathhouse and the blacksmith shop and all that, when you come and look through the windows or look into the little doors that they've got in here, these places are packed full of actual artifacts that were used in each one of these buildings. So you walk into the optical center here and you see old chair that I'm sure the optician sat in along with the place. Well, no, that's where the patient sat because you got the chin deal so that you can look through the different magnifiers to see what glass power you needed. And then he's got over here a table with all of the items to be able to cut the glass to the shape of the frames. And I guess they were making the frames. The opticians would have made the frames too, so he had to be a tinsmith.
Yep, back then, a lot of industries like this were self-contained in a sense where you weren't just the doctor doing the eye exams, you were also creating the glasses, cutting the glass, making the frames, customizing those frames to the patient. And it's the same if you go into the dentist's office.
Now, was he out taking the teeth out of the corpses for his dentures? I mean, this is a real thing. People may think I'm joking on this, but that was a big industry. Like in the Civil War, they ran around and pulled the teeth out of all the soldiers. They were making money selling dentures.
I wouldn't be surprised. I will tell you, before actual dentists existed, the barber shops were your dentists.
They also did minor surgeries, from what I understand, like the bloodletting and some of that type of stuff. That's what that barber pole. What the colors are for.
The colors are for. So the barber shop was kind of an all-encompassing place that did a little bit of everything, not just cut your hair. They pulled your teeth, and I will tell you, probably wouldn't have been very fun to get your teeth pulled at the barbershop, because I've seen some photos from the late 1800s of it, and it doesn't look too fun.
No.
They didn't have anesthetics, for example, so you felt every little bit of it.
I'm sure.
And it usually required one guy holding you down while the other guy pulled your teeth.
Yeah.
Here, as we come around this corner, we do have, our lawyer and our doctor's office, as well as a mine company office over here, and our telegraph office there. The telegraph office has lots of cool stuff in it, a lot of old telegraphs, telephones, some of that stuff. And why that's pretty important to us is that, with that copper boom that came from Butte, kind of came right at the same time that the telephone came out. It came right at the same time as electricity became commercialized. Electricity had been being used for almost 50, 60 years prior to Edison and Tesla going through their process and actually creating viable, commercially available electricity. But we had people experimenting with it as early as the late 1700s, early 1800s. Like the voltaic pile came out in 1801.
Yeah, and I'd never really put together until I was at that museum in Ely when we were talking to that curator about the copper revolution. You always hear about the industrial revolution or all these other revolutions, but putting copper into a revolution type context just really kind of hit me hard, because everything was run on copper.
And it still is.
It's
still the copper, in my opinion, and I'm sure will be plenty of people who will disagree with me on this. Copper, in my opinion, is the most important metal used in human society today. And
I would agree with you on that. We went to the copper museum in Clarkdale, I think it's called, Arizona.
Okay, Clarksdale.
Clarksdale. Have you been to that museum?
I haven't, but it's named, just so you know, Clarksdale, Arizona is named for William Clark, one of our copper kings.
Okay.
He owned the mining operations in Clarksdale, which is actually where the name came from.
But the displays that they have in there of all kinds of different things, all the way back, like you said, to the Greeks.
Yep.
Urns and pots and just artwork and everything, because copper's such a
It's
malleable.
Yeah,
that's
malleable.
the word I'm looking for. And it's soft. You can do all kinds of things with it. And then you add tin to it, and you got bronze, and you add
zinc,
do you add?
If
Zinc.
you add zinc, you get brass.
And you can make anything with that.
And those are both. So I actually gave a presentation here at the museum in June about the history of copper in human civilization. And so going back to when the first humans using copper and what they were using it for. And so we know now through research, the Native Americans around the Lake Superior region of the United States were processing and using copper 10,000 years ago.
Really?
And so they actually were from about 9,000 BC to about 5,000 BC were actually mining and processing and using the copper, or the native copper, around Lake Superior. And right around 5000 BC, for some reason that has not been discovered yet, they stopped using copper and went back to flint.
Really?
And the prevailing theory is that processing native copper and processing flint is almost about the same amount of effort, but it's a little bit less effort to collect the flint than it is to get the copper out, and so they just transitioned back to it. Or there's another theory that maybe disease kind of wiped out a large portion, and that just the concept of it was lost by the people who survived.
Isn't that interesting?
And what's really interesting is that occurred at the same time Europe began its Copper Age. So as the Native Americans here were essentially reverting back to the Stone Age from what is their Copper Age, Europe and Asia and the Middle East were now entering their Copper Age.
How cool is that?
And then the last part of Hellroaring Gulch that we have is on this side. So we have our milliners, which would be your dress shop. That's the basically
like a tailor shop.
Yeah, it's a tailor shop, but it's all for it's specifically for women.
Okay.
So it would be your dresses, your hats, all that kind of stuff. Your tobacco shop, which would have been a very prominent location. Of course, before tobacco shops, everything was through the general store. So your general store would have big barrels of tobacco to sell.
Right.
Back then, tobacco was very popular, not just smoking, but chewing. In fact, you guys should hear a pretty interesting story about that on the underground tour. I won't tell it because I don't want to steal it.
Actually, and this is the livery stable.
This is the livery stable, and that's Michael. He's actually going to be your tour guide when you guys do your tour. So, like I said, you guys should hear some really good stories from him as well. And as we move past the livery, which we do have some really cool stuff in there, some different saddles,
harnesses,
chaps.
Yeah.
We have now our Chinese remedy drugstore as well as the laundry. And so these were actually from a shop here in Butte.
Oh, really?
That was saved and kept here. And the laundry over here, again, a lot of the stuff we have in here, it came from the Chinese laundry that was here in town. In fact, about 3 weeks ago, the grandson of the shop owner was here at the museum visiting.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and he actually gave us some photos of his grandfather when he first arrived and built the laundry.
Oh, that's awesome.
And then right over there, we kind of walked past it and talk about, we do have the quote-unquote supervisor's house, which is supposed to be the mine supervisor. Is most of the mine supervisors lived on or near the mine yards, because they needed to be around and be accessible. And then this is a little, our machine shop, which needs some love. We're working on it right now. Each of the exhibits is getting I'm kind of going to each exhibit as the months go by and reorganizing and revitalizing them to kind of really, my intention here with the museum is to make each exhibit look as if it's a snapshot from that time period. So you can easily stand.
Most of these buildings, the ones I've looked into, you've done an awesome job of that. I mean,
thank you.
It's all set up just about the way you'd expect the shop to be set up when you show up.
Yeah, and that's the goal, is so that you visiting the museum can look and almost imagine people walking around and actually working in those shops and living in there and doing those daily tasks.
Okay, and you've got an ice house set up over here.
Ice house and sauerkraut house, and these are original buildings that were brought in from their locations and put in to the town. So
was sauerkraut a big deal here? I always think of German when I think of sauerkraut, not Irish.
Well, and so that's, again, going back to we had, Irish is the ones that today people focus on.
Right.
But we had people from all over the world. Meterville was a highly Italian neighborhood. We had a big population of Italians. We had Finntown, which is a big group of Finnish and Swedish immigrants that were living in there. And the sauerkraut factory, I actually think, wasn't German in this case. It was actually Swedish.
Now I'm gonna throw something out here. The Swedes, were they mostly involved in the timber part of it? Or were they? Because I always think of Swedes as being timbermen.
I imagine,
doing the tie hacks and
they probably were a big part of the timber industry. I wouldn't be surprised to learn that, but I don't know for sure. I'd have to look into that one.
Okay, yeah, it's just one of those things that I've always kind of heard. Swedes were big into the timber aspect of development. Like in the tie camps.
It wouldn't be surprising, especially given the amount of timber needed in the mining industry. If you had come to Butte in the between 1930 and the 1970s, you would not have seen any trees
Right.
around here. And that's because every tree around here was cut down for fuel or to be used for cribbing or timbering in the mines. And so it wouldn't be surprising at all if they were involved in that aspect of the industry here. I mean, Anaconda had its own timber company that it owned to do all of that. So wouldn't be surprising. People did tend to stick with what they knew. A lot of our early underground miners were Cornish actually here in Butte, because the Cornish had years of experience mining copper over in Cornwall. And so they were coming here because they knew they could get a job doing what they already knew, what they were experienced as, which is why they were able to get paid well. Butte's miners, at least in the beginning, were some of the highest paid industrial workers in the country.
Really?
Yeah. You could make good money working in the mines here. Even the prospecting guys were averaging between $20 and $50 a day. In the 1860s when they were prospecting, and that's the equivalent in today's money of about $105 a day to $200 a day, depending. Depending on. I
think it's higher than that.
If you're bringing 50, you're talking probably closer to $700 a day.
Yeah.
But the $20 a day is about $105 to $110 in today's money.
Okay.
It kind of just depends on the amount you were getting. But guys, we have plenty of newspaper articles talking about, the prospectors pulling out anywhere from $20, $30, $40, $50 out of just the gold panning. And so, as I was saying earlier, they tried smelting that copper and they shipped it. Reportedly, they made about $50,000 off that first shipment, which
that's not bad.
For 1866 is quite a bit of money. That's probably getting close to $500,000 or more in today's money.
Yeah. And you've got an ice house over here, which you don't see very often.
You don't, but they were very important buildings. You would get your ice shipped in from places like the Great Lakes or Alaska, and then these houses were set up and built for that ice to last. And it wouldn't be, what we think of, like, you go to the grocery store and buy a bag of ice, you get a little 7-pound bag of cube ice. They would be shipping huge, massive pieces of ice that probably weighed 1 or 2 tons or more. And the reason they would ship it so big is it keeps the ice being that large will keep itself from melting quickly. And then once they get it into those ice houses, it won't melt.
And the ice house was super well insulated, had drainage on the bottom, and then once they packed the ice in, they would pack it around sawdust in order to keep it from melting, and they could keep the ice all year long.
And then they would just essentially, they'd have somebody who worked there, and he would chip off the ice as people needed it. And
put it in their ice box.
Yep.
And he's got an ice saw over the top that has Crystal Ice Company, because they would go out onto the lakes and saw. It'd be a big party from what I've seen. And they'd have the ice picks or not ice picks, but ice tongs that'd grab onto the ice, and they'd pull them out with horses. And it was quite the operation back in the day.
And it was a whole industry. There's so many industries like that just you don't even think about those kind of things.
When we were young, we used to have a milkman that came around the house and delivered milk in the little tin freezer thing that you set out on your porch. But that guy's long gone.
Oh, yeah.
So,
well, heck, you don't even
his children are still around.
Yeah, you don't even see the newspaper guys anymore these days.
But now here's a piece that absolutely 100% fascinates the heck out of me. I've seen it, and I was hoping that we'd get by it while you were here. This is a tractor that is set up with corkscrew drive. If you don't have any idea what a corkscrew drive is, get on YouTube and look at corkscrew drive tractors. They have, it's a regular tractor that the wheels have been taken off, and it's got a gearbox in the back that will run some corkscrews that are the length of the tractor, probably 2 foot round, and it has ribs on it so that when you push forward, the tractor will move forward crawling with those corkscrews. You can also make it go straight sideways. Either way, you can make it go in reverse. And these things, they floated on top of snow, they floated on top of gravel, water, just about anything. It's absolutely amazing.
Yeah,
and you don't ever get to see them in real person unless you come to the World Museum of Mining right here in Butte.
To my knowledge, there's only 6 left in existence, and this is one of them, and I couldn't tell you where the other 5 actually are. But I will say this is the Fordson Snow Machine. So they created it with the intention of making a snowmobile.
Right.
And from what I understand, its main reason for not being super successful is the weight of it caused it to get stuck easy if you didn't have really hard-packed snow or ground to move on.
Really?
So if it was really fresh, soft pack, it would get stuck. Just by the weight of it, and that
maybe it needed bigger fins.
It may be. I wouldn't know. I do know you can look it up on YouTube.
Oh yeah, YouTube's got a guy driving
one that's a newer video, but there's also, if you look it up, you can find one from it running in 1926.
Really?
And it's an old video of one running back when it actually was made. And they could do about 15 miles an hour. So which to a lot of people today probably seems pretty slow, but for a vehicle in 1926, that was pretty good. You were moving, and especially for what type of vehicle it is.
I was going to say, moving across the snow
at 15 miles an hour is a pretty good clip. So they didn't make a lot of them either. That was another reason why they're pretty hard to find. And it is a kit that was designed and created to work on the Fordson tractor, which is this tractor here sitting next to it. Same tractor, just a different kit using just a different kit on there to showcase why you would have these different vehicles. And that was the intention, was to make these kits you could put on the tractor to own one tractor but a bunch of kits, so you have the capability to do all these different jobs. And that's something you don't find in a lot of tools today. Maybe a little bit. The farm industry is still pretty good about making pretty cool tractors and devices.
Well, look at the Bobcats and the case.
Yeah,
the
Bobcats
skid steers.
are good. Yeah,
I mean, holy smokes! You can buy 1,000 attachments for those things.
And you only need
just
the
about
one.
And you only need the one. Yeah.
And so that's one of the industries that's kind of maintained that idea, because tools aren't like that anymore.
Right.
I have my grandfather's shopsmith from back.
The shops,
yeah, and so that, it's a drill press, a lathe,
a saw,
a table saw, all in one device, and you just switch out the parts you need to use it.
Right.
And today, if you want to get those, you got to buy all those tools individually.
Right.
And man, it's a...
And have a different cord for everyone.
Yeah,
but there again, if you wanted your saw and then wanted to do something on the lathe, you were constantly having
switching stuff out.
I guess
in that side, that
I was
going
to say it, and I don't know about the shopsmith, but it seems like it's not the easiest thing to flip everything around. But I've never. It's a little bit of.
I mean, it's a little bit of a hassle. I think it's worth it, but that's because, again, I'm a bit of a nerd for history, so.
Well, and it's Grandpa's.
And it's exactly. And so here, as we're moving now to outside of the Loren Gulch, we're going into the actual Orphan Girl mine yard. So all the land that all the museum is based on is actually was originally different mine claims.
Let me ask you another question as we're walking over here. Butte, from what I understand, is built on top of the mine.
Yes.
And there is nothing but shafts and everything else underneath all of Butte. Is that correct?
It is. So the majority of the city, especially uptown, is built over the mine structure, was what I call it, is all your different shafts and drifts. So shafts are your vertical tunnels, if you will, and drifts are your horizontal ones, and then you have your cross cuts and stuff like that.
I didn't know any of that.
So, there's thousands of miles of drifts beneath the city.
Thousands of miles?
Thousands of miles.
Now, there aren't any operations still going, are there?
There is the open, so we have the Continental Pit, which is an open pit over by the Berkeley Pit, and that is a currently operating mine run by Montana Resources, which is owned by Dennis Washington, one of our big guys here in Montana.
Okay.
And his foundation and his companies have been really good to Butte and Montana as a whole. But we also have Black Butte Silver Mining Company that is going to be, hopefully they're working on it, opening up a shaft and going in underground and starting an underground mine, which would be the first underground mining in Butte since 1982.
Now, are all of the shafts and drifts and that, are they flooded now?
For the most part, I think some of them, like our mine, the 100-foot levels are above the water line, but the majority.
Good, because I didn't want to put on scuba gear when I went on the tour this afternoon.
Yeah, you shouldn't have to worry about getting too wet down there. But yeah, everything is underwater now for the most part, and that is because all of our mines kind of sit in the natural aquifer that is beneath the city. So they were constantly pumping water to operate those mines.
Could they even pump it out again in order to run it again, or?
That is a wonderful question.
Because I know, like, they let the Homestake mine in Leeds, South Dakota flood, and I think they said they were never going to be able to get back in there to do any gold mining or anything because of the pump. They weren't going to be able to pump the water back out.
So I don't know if they could. I would assume, based on what I've read about previous operations, so our mine was flooded and dewatered multiple times during its years of operation.
Okay.
But that was intentional, and so I don't know. And that was only it would sit full of water for a few years and then get dewatered and mined. So it's different than, it's been sitting. All these mines have been sitting full of water for 40 years now.
Wow.
So it would be maybe a different thing, and I don't know. I know that I have asked about that to people who know more than I do about that stuff, and I've never really been able to get a definitive answer of whether they would be able to drain and go back. I know a lot of it was backfilled with debris and stuff like that as they were moving through. So I suppose if the shafts have stayed in good enough condition, they would at least maybe have the opportunity or the option to do it. But I also imagine it would be very, very expensive. And that could be probably the deciding factor of whether it would be worth it or not. I will tell you this, Butte is known as the richest hill on earth, and not just because of what we've pulled out of the ground, but because of what's still in the ground.
Really?
So, yeah, there's still a vast amount of mineral wealth sitting beneath the city. So eventually,
that may be an option at some point in time.
Eventually the incentive might be there for them to decide, you know what, it's financially worth our time to do it. So it's hard to say.
Wow.
And so,
now, as we're walking along, we're coming into more of the mine yard, I guess you would say.
Yep.
You've got a nice old stamp mill.
Yep.
Which was made for crushing the rock as it came out, if I understand that correctly.
And one of our tour guides today told me somebody on his tours used the word pulverize, which I love so much more.
Right.
But yeah, it crushed your rock up, and it basically was taking, pieces of ore and making them into a sand-like substance. And
it had great big weights that ran on a wheel on a cam that would come up and down and smash the.
Yeah, and what's really interesting about as a device so this is one of my history nerd moments. The stamp mill as a concept and a device dates back to Hellenistic Greece. So
really?
They've been using this same type of device for over 2,000 years in the mining industry. Now, the difference between what we see at our museum here, this got the cast iron parts, theirs were made entirely out of wood, but it still functioned and worked the same concept, was to crush up your ore and make it usable and easier to smelt and process.
But rock's harder than wood. How would it?
Well, so if you use stuff like, they would have probably used a lot of olive wood, and olive is a very hard wood, and so they also probably could have attached stone. I've seen diagrams of them. I haven't done enough research to tell you the exact makeup of theirs, but I've seen the diagrams from Greece that show almost the exact same device you see sitting right here in front of us.
Okay.
And so, and depending on the type of ore too, if you were to roast it first, once the ore's roasted, it's much more
breakable, fracturable.
Yeah, fracturable. So that may have been enough to make it so the wood could crush it. It probably would not be nearly as efficient as using the metal hammers we have today.
Right.
But it's just that concept of this device has been used in the mining industry for thousands of years.
That's amazing.
And this one here is actually a model that was created in California that took the concept a little bit further. Instead of just picking up the hammers and dropping them down, this one, when it drops, it actually spins the hammer.
Oh, really?
And so it has
rotational.
Not just a crushing, but a rotational motion. And
Really?
that grind. So not only was it crushing, it was grinding as it hit, and that allowed for even better processing of that ore.
Wow, that is cool. Okay, now explain these bullet-shaped rocks.
So
are those core samples?
These are actually pieces of slag that were found here when they were digging to do a foundation here in Butte as part of the reclamation process, and they found about 100 of these buried underground, and so we got a few of them here.
So this is from the smeltering
The smelters,
plants.
yeah, these are from the smelters, and so if you notice, you'll actually see there's a bit of copper in them. That's because up until electrolytic refining came out in the 1890s, the smelting process was not super efficient. They would actually lose about 20 to 30% of the metal into the slag in that process. You didn't retain all of the metal, and so that's why you'll see, if you look at older slag, like these, probably my guess would be probably came from the 1880s, maybe even the 1870s. It's hard to say I don't personally know the exact location they were found in. That would probably help me narrow down the age a little bit better if I knew what smelter they came from. But these are pieces of slag that weigh about 500 pounds each a piece. They're about 500 pounds a piece. What I like to tell on my tours, and what's really fascinating to me is if these were entirely made out of copper, they would weigh about 3,500 pounds.
Oh.
Copper, as soft and malleable as it is very dense, and so
Okay.
it's heavy. And so if you've ever picked up a spool of copper wire, you know
Right,
exactly
yeah,
what I'm
yeah.
talking about. It's heavy for as small as it is. It's real heavy. Copper ingots. We have in our archives Anaconda's handbook, their company handbook from 1921, and so it gives a description of all of the materials they produced from their factories around here. And one of those is the copper ingots coming from the refineries. And so the largest ingots they produced were cake ingots, and those would either be round cakes or square cakes. And a round cake would be 20 inches in diameter and 5 inches thick. So it doesn't seem like it's that big, right?
No,
it's fairly decent size, but not huge. That weighed 500 pounds.
Wow.
So if you took that and you put it inside of these, this is how I like to do the math. You put it inside, you could probably fit 5 or 6 of those in here, maybe more. And so that's how you know if these were made just purely of copper, they would be massive, heavy pieces. They're still heavy. 500 pounds is, and
500 pounds is more than I want to pick up.
Yeah. Well, and I like to tell people, we leave them sitting out like this because we're not worried about somebody picking them up. If you can pick up a 500-pound object on your own, you're welcome to it.
Well, now the reason I'm so curious about these is I just ended up with about 10 rocks that are shaped very similar to this.
Okay.
And I was thinking that they were concrete because they're a gray color. But when one of them fractured when I was putting it down, because it has fractures in it like this, I was able to see crystallized rock running around through it, and I didn't know what the heck they were. Now I've got an idea that these things probably came from a smelter someplace.
They probably are. They are probably slag from a smelter, and so depending on the material being smelted, your slag is going to come out a little bit different. Today's
who
slag
knows where these ones came from?
Yeah, today's slag almost looks like obsidian in a lot of the way it's processed. But
really?
Back then, because you had so much metal being contained in it, and depending on the type of material you're smelting, I mean, if you were smelting something like zinc or tin or silver, you might end up with more of a gray. And that crystallized rock you see is going to be, so when you're smelting, you're melting everything.
Right.
And that includes the granite and the quartz and all that stuff that's in the ore. So that slag does contain all of that stuff. And so you would potentially find veins of it in that slag. Because if you'll notice the way that this is, it's layered. So it didn't all come out at once. They were scraping off the slag, and as it harden the next, they scrape off more, and so you get layers in there, and that's why it's like that, is because it takes a process. Back in 1860, in the 1850s, the smelting process from getting your ore to having a finished product took about a year.
Wow.
And they got that down in the 1870s to about 4 days. And then with electrolytic...
That's quite the jump.
Quite the jump. It took them about 40 years, but they got from when Swansea was the main smelting area of the world, it would take about a year to process that copper and get it and realize the finished product. By the time America's industry took over, we were into about 4 days, and then electrolytic refining, which came out in 1890, 1891, changed the whole game, because then you could get 100% retention of the metals. So your slag was all waste, and your metal, you were getting all of it, which is actually one of the reasons Butte was able to become the dominant copper producer in the country, because our copper ores didn't just have copper in them, they had gold and silver.
Right.
And so not only were we getting all of the copper, now we're getting all of the gold and silver. So we're making an immense amount of profit on that, and we were able to produce even more copper than, say, Michigan, which was producing all native copper. We were able to produce more copper than them because of that electrolytic refining process coming into play and allowing us to get 100% of the metal out of the rock.
Wow. Well, Lyndon, now you have your answer to what those rocks are in the yard.
Yeah, I'll have to do some more research.
Yeah.
And
that is cool.
Size-wise, I mean, you can get big.
Yeah, ours are probably just a little bit bigger than that.
Okay.
But yeah.
And which you mentioned earlier, Anaconda and their big crucibles.
Right.
It's the same. If you notice, that actually is a very similar shape
right.
to those big crucibles, and that's because they use big crucibles to make that stuff. So.
Wow.
And they essentially, you're literally just, what they would use a lot of the times here in Butte to flux the copper ore as they were smelting it was iron. So they would put a little bit of iron in there, and it would grab up all of your waste and pull it out, and then you'd scrape that off into your crucible to get rid of your slag.
Now here's something I haven't seen in a lot of years. We just walked into, what building is this?
So this is our hoist house, which also happens to hold our mock-up of the shower and dry, which would have been its own building at one point, but this we turned the mine office into the shower and dry so that people could see just an idea of what the guys coming out of a shift were going into.
And so they were all able to shower before they went home.
Yeah, they were able to shower before, and I will tell you, we have conflicting stories from guys who worked in the mines. So this isn't necessarily from research, but we have guys on both sides who worked in mines around the country. Some of them say you went straight into the showers wearing your diggers. Some of them will say, no, we didn't do that. We got undressed, went in, showered, and washed our clothes out by hand. And so we know both are true because obviously these guys lived it. So it probably depended on the mine you worked in. It depended probably on the individual, whether you were willing to just go in and shower in your clothes. I will tell you, if you were working in the copper mines, you had to rinse out your clothes when you came up, because if you didn't, your clothes were going to disintegrate pretty quickly from all the sulfuric acid. And that's because our mines here, most of our ore here is sulfides. And so as those sulfides, that sulfur in the ore mixes with the groundwater, it turns into sulfuric acid. And so that acid would be dripping on the guys working in the mines. And so
did they end up with open sores?
They had they would get what they called copper sores. And so on their necks and their hands, they would get open wounds from the acid burns. And so they always called it copper water, but it was essentially sulfuric acid is what it was. It was probably a little diluted because it was mixing with the groundwater, so it wasn't just pure acid, but it was enough where guys would get copper sores on their necks, on their hands.
And what did they do for it? I mean, did they come out and wash with baking soda or something in order to neutralize the acid, or
I actually don't know.
An alkali?
I imagine so. You'd have to do something, but I don't know.
I don't know if borax would be an alkaline pH to where washing with borax would be, because that was a common cleaner.
That was a common, that was a very common cleaner at the time. I'd have to look into that a little bit to see, because I'm not sure.
Okay, but what struck me is when I walked in here, you've got a sink that is about 5 foot in diameter, with a foot pedal on the bottom that you step on. They had these back when I was a kid in all of the bathrooms, but I haven't seen one in years. And then they put borax soap
in the top.
There's a little borax container that you put a little lever, and the borax comes down into your hands, and
and
I just haven't. And they're marble, aren't they? Or what
I believe so.
They look like marble.
This is definitely stone. So and looking at it, it looks like marble to me.
Yeah, I haven't seen one in years. I never even thought about missing them either till I walked in here, and all of a sudden first grade comes back.
I mean, to me, the concept of it works a lot better. You don't have to use your hand to turn the water on.
Or flail your hand,
and
then go to the next one and flail, and then go to the next one until one of them finally recognizes somebody wants some dang water.
Yeah,
isn't that the truth?
And so this room here is the hoist engine room. So this is where the hoist engine was located, and so. I won't get, I guess, too much into it because I don't want to spoil the tour for you guys. But
well, let me just kind of explain what it is. You've got some major spools that had cable on them.
Large steel cable.
Steel cable, and a big electric motor, it looks like, here on the end. It was probably steam at one point in time, I'm assuming.
So our early hoists here in Butte would have been operated by steam power, and even the earlier, smaller hoisting operations were probably operating on horsepower. So you would literally, the original version of horsepower, I should say.
Right.
So you'd have devices where the horses could walk and operate those. But as you got into the bigger ones, they would use steam power or compressed air to operate. And so I can tell you in the 1934, Anaconda had 4 electric hoists and 11 compressed air and a few steam. So it must have been the 1920s, but they still had the majority of their hoists operating off of compressed air and steam.
Now, we just went through Silver Star.
Okay.
And Silver Star, Montana has a bunch of those old wheels. Have you been to Silver Star?
I haven't.
Oh, you need to go down there. They've got the wheels set up on the outside that were running these cables, and for the compressors and stuff. And they're all set up. They're 22 foot tall.
Yeah, I imagine they've got to be massive. We actually have an air compressor in the other room here. Okay, yeah. So they had massive air compressors and massive steam engines that ran these things in the beginning before the electricity.
There's a picture that we took in Silver Star
from
that
the
shows how
mine.
the compressors work.
Yeah.
And this guy supposedly hauled all this stuff down in the 80s and set it up to where you can see it as you're driving down the road. It's really pretty cool.
Lloyd Harkins. So ironically, we have the Lloyd and Ann Harkins mine yard right behind this, which is Lloyd Harkins, that gentleman.
Right.
All of our big equipment our mine yard out here is named after him because he also helped get this museum set up.
That's cool.
Okay.
So he was one of our big help get us.
Well, you need to take the drive 30. Well, I guess it's over the mountain. Well, no, it's probably only 35 miles from here.
Yeah, it's not too far.
And just pull off the road and look at that yard. It's just unbelievable.
I will have to get over there and check.
And for the listeners, it's only 35 miles kind of southeast of Butte is kind of where it's at. Or if you go to Whitehall, it's 17 miles from Whitehall.
Okay.
And it's a pretty neat place to pull your car off and get some neat pictures of some big mine equipment. Or pulleys and some of these winches and some of that stuff.
Yeah, and these, so, now my brain is thinking of that. So,
when can I go to Silver Star?
But these hoists, so one of the things we like to tell and emphasize is the hoist operators were, some of the most important guys on the mine yard. And so for a long time, they were the only guys that had to actually get trained and certified and educated to do their jobs.
Okay.
For the most part, you could show up to a mine yard and they basically hand you a shovel and make you a mucker, or they'd make you a tool guy, which is a nipper. And so you're either running tools or shoveling ore. And then eventually they'd maybe start letting you handle explosives, all kinds of stuff. But none of that required formal training. This guy had to be formally trained and certified to operate the hoist, and that's because if he screws up his job, it could be catastrophic.
Right.
It could cost lives, cost millions of dollars. One of the things I like to tell people on my tours is in the state of Tennessee, it is actually a felony to speak to a hoist operator while he's operating the hoist. You can go to prison for doing
I guess
so.
I could see that.
And that's because if you distract him and he misses something, it could be, I mean, you could cost people their lives. And so it's not a felony in Montana, but it is, you will get fired if you were to speak to the hoist operator while he's operating the hoist. And if you're not important, especially, you're getting canned pretty quickly.
The thing is, can you even speak to him? I would imagine that the noise of all of this is beyond the point of conversation.
Probably, yeah. You're not going to just be talking to him. You probably have to be yelling at him. But even then, just that, it's just a small distraction because he's listening to those bells right there for setting up these signals and these codes. And so if he misses a bell, you know, he could send the cage to the wrong place. He can move it at the wrong speed. Men and materials moved at vastly different speeds.
Oh, really?
And that's with the weight differences.
Right.
If you were to move men at the speed you move material, when you stop that cage, it's going to bounce 30 or 40 feet up in the air.
Wow.
And up and down. And so if you're a guy standing in that cage, your day is about to get really bad.
Okay, and he's got a code of mine signals, which he said was all run off of the bells.
And these are universal to the entire state of Montana. Every underground mine in this state.
Just in this state? They don't do the same?
I do not know if they use the same codes across the country. This was actually, it passed by the state of Montana back in the 30s.
Okay.
So this is a universal code for Montana. I would imagine, given the amount of training needed for this type of job, you probably do have a universal code across the country so that guys could move around the country. And that was the purpose of this, is so guys could move between different mines and not have to relearn or learn new codes. And whether you worked in a coal mine, a platinum mine, a copper mine, or a silver mine here in Montana, you're going to be using those same codes.
I can see I would have problems already. Because they've got bells that go station 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, all the way up to 11, and I've only got 10 fingers.
And it gets a little bit more. It gets a little bit more complicated too. But there is actually a math equation that will get you. If you add 10 to the station number and divide by 5, it'll give you your codes. And so I always use station number 1 for this because I was a grunt in the Marine Corps and math is not a strong suit of mine.
Okay.
Unless I have crayons to count with.
Well, I got fingers, but only to 10.
But so if you add 10 to 1, you get 11. Divide
Okay.
11 by 5, you get 2 with a remainder of 1.
Okay.
So that's your code for that station. And that equation it will work all the way down. And so if you didn't have your sign or your sign wasn't readable, if you knew what station you were on, you could at least get the code for the station you were on by doing that simple math. I say simple math, but it's not that simple in my opinion.
Right.
Do those numbers on those boards up there have anything to do with this?
So those represent the station. So that 1 is the 100-foot station, and that was how the hoist operator knew where his cage was. And so as he was lowering it down, that arrow would move with the cage. And so as he was getting close to the 100-foot station, he would know, okay, I'm getting close. And if they were supposed to stop at the 100-foot station, as he was getting there, the guy in the cage would ring the bell to stop, and he would know, okay, I'm stopping at the 100-foot station. And so that would tell him roughly where his cage was at in the mine.
That's really good.
And they have a lot of different meanings for the bells. Yeah, bell number 1 is the bell hoist, bell stop if in motion. 2 bells lower men. 3 bells hoist men. 4 bells is blasting signal. So if you hear 4 bells, you better be hiding.
Well, you wouldn't stay in the mine for that. So that's doing the 4 bells is basically okay. That's we want out, and because blasting is about to take place, and so at that point, if anyone's in the mine, it's just the guys blasting, not anyone else.
And then you go up to 9 bells, which is the danger signal.
Yeah, and so 9 bells was the universal emergency code. And so any kind of emergency, whether it's fire, anything else, you were sending up 9 bells, and that would tell them up top, something's wrong, we need to get ready to address that issue. So they would send out word, an ambulance would come, they would get ready to deal with whatever issue was going to be coming up.
That's when you call your friend that you don't know well named Big John and have him hold up the timbers till you get out.
Yeah.
So they had some sort of electric down there where they can push a button or something?
So you guys will see this on the tour. There's a rope that you would pull, and yeah, there was electric signals that came all the way down. There was a rope that they would pull, and that would send up and the signal to ring the bells up here.
Hopefully that rope is in good shape.
For example, the Granite Mountain fire, when that fire happened, it actually did damage the cables, and they weren't able to communicate, and that was part of the reason that some of the problems happened, is they weren't able to, they were able to notify that there was an emergency, and then some of the damage took place, and they weren't, at one point, they lowered a couple guys down, and those guys couldn't signal back up to, hey, get us out, we're going into the fire, and
they lost a couple more.
Yeah, they lost a couple because of them for that.
And then you've got a case here with basically the setup, a panorama with, or diorama, whichever one it is, with the mine setup on top.
Yeah.
And then just shows the model down below with the train cars and different stations.
This was built by a guy who worked in the mines. And from what we have a newspaper article about it that says this was supposed to be the Leonard mine, and he built this during his spare time, and then when he retired, he presented it to the company and said, hey, I made this.
Wow, that's cool.
So, his last name is Trudeau. I do not believe he has any relations to
Justin?
Yeah, but I don't know off the top of my head. But I can't think of his first name to save my life right now.
And we just walked into a room that has my jaw dropped.
This is an Ingersoll Rand air compressor. And so this massive air compressor, I mean, we're talking 30 feet by 20 feet roughly.
This thing's huge.
It's massive, huge air compressor. Puts out the same amount of PSI as a 30-gallon air compressor that you can buy from Home Depot today.
No.
Yes.
This is disappointing.
It's not, because the volume is where it matters. So this thing can run a hoist. It can run 30 rock drills at the same time, never turn off. If you try to run...
But it only runs at 125 PSI is what you're saying.
It doesn't, it's very low PSI, but they didn't...
Massive volume.
Large volumes of air, and that's what they needed to run those drills, was that volume.
Right.
Not necessarily your PSI.
Wow.
And so, if you look at it right here...
The intercooler took much of the heat of the compression out of the air coming from the low pressure side at about 30 psi. So more air would fit in the high pressure side. Hot air takes up more space, so more cool air will fit in the cylinder. The compressor was driven by a 20-inch wide flat leather belt. 20-inch wide flat leather belt from 150 horsepower. 587 RPM electric motor. The belt was kept tight by the idler pulley, but was still liable to slip a little, sometimes a lot, making the drive less efficient. Eventually, the belt would have to be replaced as it wore out. The idler pulley also lets the belt wrap around more of the small motor pulley to increase the grab to the drive belt. The large flywheel served to store energy as the pistons pulsated back and forth, going from a vacuum to over 100 psi pressure, twice each revolution. It also was a speed reduction device, running the compressor at 140 RPM. Before production stopped in 1927, thousands of these machines were sold worldwide, and some of them are still in use. There are at least 10 machines of this design within 50 miles of Butte today, although none are operating. Wow. And this compressor and motor were donated by the Antonelli family of Butte and Phillipsburg. The belt is courtesy of Lloyd Harkins of Silver Star, Montana.
There you go.
The guy we were just talking about with the big pulleys.
And you can see this is a leather belt.
Where in the world do you find a cow that long?
So if you look at it, you can actually see where they did their work. Yeah. And then if you look too, you can see it's actually two pieces of leather glued together.
Wow.
There are some stories, and there is dispute to this, that this is made out of buffalo leather. I tend to lean towards not, for a number of reasons. The hardness of it buffalo leather is typically softer. It's
Okay.
stronger, but it typically gets softer with age. And this, if you feel, is nice and hard.
Right.
But at the time that these would have been made, there were only about 1,000 buffalo left in the United States, and so it's very unlikely that they would have allowed the buffalo to be
And
harvested.
how long would these belts last?
I can't imagine for more than a couple of years, if that.
If that.
If that.
But we're
Especially if
talking
it was
about a
running
belt that runs
constantly.
around. It runs around one pulley that's 8 foot in circumference, at least 8 foot.
Oh yeah.
And then it runs through an idler that is 2
this-
foot in circumference, and then around another drive for the compressor.
It's got
that's
to be
2 foot
probably
around.
about 40 feet.
It's got to be.
About 40 feet.
It's
So
insane.
It'd be probably, I
And
imagine.
20 inches wide.
And 20 inches wide. So you're probably using 10 cows just for one belt or more.
Boy, I'll bet when they took the belts off of these, that the miners all made belts out of it. It
I
made
bet
belts
so,
for the
yeah,
whole
it probably-
for the whole village. And when they got through with that, kids got their butts whooped when they come home, and they'd been bad during the day.
Yeah.
I'm just throwing a wild guess out
I
there.
wouldn't be surprised. Well, and that's something the miners were definitely known for is they definitely pocketed things that could be useful at home that the company didn't really. They do like to say like 90% of Butte's plumbing, the pipes came from the mines.
Oh, that wouldn't
and just
surprise
small
me.
pieces that scrap pipes. The company didn't really care because it was scrap, and those guys would take it home, and so you just have large areas of just small, tiny pieces of pipe soldered together.
Oh, wow. That's crazy. That is absolutely crazy. So, we about through here, or?
Yeah, it's up to you. I mean, I could.
No, I could go all
We
doggone
can
day.
keep going. I just wanted to make sure we weren't running too close to your tour starting.
Oh, yeah, I guess we're still a little bit off from that, but this has been so totally fascinating. Like I said, I've been through here several times, but you've added so much more to my story.
Well, I'm glad to hear it. I can talk probably too much about this stuff. But then, so out here we have a few more things like this. Behind the Retirees Club board is the actual tag in, tag out board from the mine. But the Retirees Club board you see there is a club that got together after the mines closed. Guys that worked for Anaconda and Arco who bought out Anaconda.
Okay.
And so this is all of the guys who've passed away that were members of the club.
Okay.
And there's still about 9 guys left. And once they've moved on, we're going to be adding their names to it. They've asked us to do that. But I like to stop pointing out because my great-grandfather is on, one of my great-grandfathers is on that plaque there.
Wow.
He drove trucks up at the Berkeley pit towards the end of his career. He worked in the mines here.
Okay, now you've got a check-in and check-out board on the back.
Yeah, and so that's...
So they knew exactly who was in that mine all the
Yes,
time.
They knew, and so you had your tags. Every miner had a tag that had a number on it. That number was exclusive to you, and it was always going to be exclusive to you. They didn't reuse the numbers.
Okay.
And so that was one way that they were able to track who was down there. The other one is every shift before time cards and all that stuff. They had what's called the timekeeper, and that was the guy who stood with a book, and he stood right next to the shaft. And as you loaded into the cage, he wrote down your name and what time you went down. And he knew the names and faces of every guy working on that shift. And if you had to say a bigger mine with like a larger crew, you may have multiple timekeepers. But if you had a smaller crew with 40 guys, that guy knew the name and face of everybody who was working in that mine, especially on that shift. The one thing they couldn't tell you is where you were in the mine.
Right.
At that time, they didn't have the ability to track that, especially because you could go down I'm going down to the 600-foot level. You're not going to spend your whole shift potentially on the 600-foot level. So you could be moving up and down the mine throughout the day or throughout your shift working on different stuff. And so they couldn't track that specifically, but this was a way for them to be able to track who was in the mine at what time, which was important because once everybody came out, if a tag didn't come off the board, that meant, okay, hey, that guy
need to go
that
find
guy
him.
could be stuck underground. Maybe he got hurt. Of course, if they looked in the mines and didn't find you, they knew where to find you. They were going to go look at the bars because you probably were out throwing them back with your buddies and you just forgot to move your tag, which was a fireable offense.
Wow.
You would get fired.
I can imagine, though. You got to
Yeah.
keep track of that stuff.
Yeah, well, because when they have to go look for you, they cannot they might have to shut operations down to look for you, and that's money gone.
Oh, yeah.
That they're not getting back. And it may not seem like a lot for losing a couple $1,000s, but back then $1,000 is tens of thousands today. So
no doubt,
definitely important for them to make sure they were tagging in and tagging out.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about safety regulations, no safety regulations, OSHA, the Mine Safety Board. How did all of that stuff kind of come about? Because I know in 1860 it probably mattered whether somebody died in the mine, but it was just a casualty, I would assume, versus the 1930s, somebody dying in the mine, it becoming a fence of some sort or another, compensation to the family.
So I know that they did in the early 1900s.
Can we step back inside?
Oh,
I'm
yeah.
afraid that the wind's going to affect our microphones.
Instead of going in here, let's step up into St. Helena's, and only because they're doing the tour in there.
Yeah, no, that'd be great. Sometimes the wind really affects my mics.
Okay, yeah, I wouldn't. I'm not surprised. I don't know a whole ton about MSHA and its regulations and how it got started, but MSHA is the mine safety it's the equivalent of OSHA.
Okay.
For mining.
Now are they controlled by OSHA also, or is it all?
I think that they're an independent organization.
That's kind of what I was under the impression of, but there again, I don't know.
Yeah, I have to admit this one's a little outside of my expertise, but I imagine it arose from just basically mine safety issues because guys were getting hurt. And granted, the companies had incentive to, keep guys alive and safe, because it's a lot less expensive to pay a guy who knows what he's doing than to have to bring in new people, train them,
right,
and pay them too, on top of now the veteran guy who's going to teach them. And so...
But you were working with a lot of, I won't say primitive equipment because it was really advanced in the day, but when you're working with open cables and open cars and open pulleys and no guards and that type of stuff, injuries are just bound to happen. I mean, it's just like the farmers back in the 30s probably had less fingers than the farmers now.
Probably, yeah. And so, to my knowledge, the earliest type of injury insurance that you'd find in the mines came after the Granite Mountain fire, when they started implementing essentially they would pay for funeral costs. So it wasn't really even insurance, it was just enough to pay for funeral costs, and there were stipulations to that, if you if I remember correctly, if you didn't use all of the money to pay for the funeral, or if you spent too much money, so you could get essentially a life insurance payout, which was $4,000.
Okay.
And that was either spread out over the course of, you'd get a portion of it every week, or you could get it as a lump sum. But in order to get it as a lump sum, you couldn't spend more than $75 on the funeral. And at that time, when that was the case, most funerals averaged about $100 to $125. So they literally made it so that if you tried to have an actual funeral, you wouldn't get the money. And their intention is if you were paying it out over time, they paid out only $10 a week.
Right.
So it would take a significant amount of time to pay out that full $4,000. Most likely, you're not going to end up ever paying out that full $4,000 to the relative who survived, because they're probably not going to live long enough to actually claim all $4,000. And so they had ways around actually paying out that money.
It's not like an insurance company.
And it's not. No, it was an agreement. Yeah. It was an agreement. It was basically the company agreed to do it because they were trying to take some of the heat off themselves for the fires happening. So it wasn't even like a standard thing at that time to do it. It was more of they were taking some heat from the public about the fires, and so they did that to kind of cover themselves a little bit, and it wasn't adequate to pay.
But it looked good on paper.
Or in the press.
In the press.
In the press, yeah. And the press, of course, at that time was owned by the mine companies, so they, for the most part,
Not so unlike today.
yeah, exactly.
Not trying to get political, but
No, you're not wrong. And that's, I mean, Clark had his newspapers and Daly had his newspapers, and they were major rivals, and so it was the same. And then even after they were gone, it was the same thing. You know, you had the papers that sided with the miners, and you had papers that sided with the companies. And so everything was dominated by politics of what we would call today. I mean, it was all
right.
The guys running Amalgamated and by default Anaconda were all, you know, the same people who were monopolizing oil and the railroads and all that stuff. So they knew the games to play, so to speak, to keep themselves in the money and make sure their workers only got enough to make them happy.
Sounds, yeah, that's the way it works. Still the way it works.
Still the way it works. Same for the unions and all that stuff is very much the same.
Now, when did the unions come into play, and was there a big union disagreements or resistance to the unions here in Butte?
So in the beginning, no. In fact, from what I've read and seen, Daly, Clark, and Heinze all were pretty friendly with the unions in the beginning. And Butte was actually known as the Gibraltar of unionism.
Okay.
Because unionism as a whole in the United States really kind of got its solid start here in Butte.
Oh, really?
And like the major organizations, because of what Butte was at that time, being as important of a city as it was in the mining industry, the miners' union got started, and that's actually why the Butte miners were some of the best paid industrial workers in the country, is that they formed a union and they made an agreement with the companies. You have to pay us $3.50 a day for our work, or you could be a contract miner and get paid by the amount of tonnage you brought out of the mine, which actually ended up, for the most part, being a more profitable version, but it wasn't a guarantee, because if you didn't bring anything good out, you weren't going to get paid as well.
Right.
But $3.50 a day in the 1890s and 1880s was the equivalent of making about $110 a day today.
Right.
And you were making about $1,000 a month, $1,000 a month, which, no, that's not right.
It'd be $3,000.
$3,000 a
Yeah.
month, which is, I mean, a pretty decent job in most places today.
Right.
And back then was a very high paying job to get that much money. Now, granted, at that time it was the third most hazardous job you could have in the United States, so working in the mines was not the safest. But today, if you work in a mine, the miners, I think it doesn't even make the top 25 list of most hazardous jobs. Yeah,
well,
mining is very much a safer industry today than it used to be. And a lot of that was driven by the guys working in the industry themselves. A perfect example of that is silicosis, or miners' consumption, which is from the dust in the mines. Miners figured out very quickly how to circumvent that issue by adding water to the drills, creating drills that could pump water through them, spraying the walls, and they almost basically eliminated that danger for themselves. And not because at that time MSHA hadn't come out yet, so it wasn't necessarily, you know, because of an organization say, hey, this is dangerous. It was the guys who actually worked in the mines who knew it was dangerous and were like, hey, we need to do something about this and change something. And so they did.
That's cool. That's kind of what needs to happen. It needs to come from the bottom up.
It does. And admittedly, there are some issues in the East right now with the coal mines and silicosis, because they're starting to get into the granite over there instead of just the coal beds, and the granite is where that silicosis becomes an issue, and there's some problems with getting the recognition that silicosis is coming into play, and not just the black lung from coal dust, which is though very similar disease, actually different, and how it affects the body is different.
Wow. That is, yeah. It's still evolving.
Yeah, it's still...
Well, and everything, I guess, always does.
Oh, yeah. There's things going through. And one thing about the unions, because I think I kind of got a little off track, was in 1914, the miners' union here in Butte ended. And because at that time, the union bosses were pretty much in the pocket of the company, of Anaconda and Amalgamated.
Okay.
And so the miners said, enough, and they blew up the miners' union hall. as a kind of a message to the bosses,
Right.
like, hey man, you're not going to play this game anymore. Only the union dissolved, and then they couldn't get another union formed that the company didn't just shut down by breaking it up.
Okay.
And so even after the Granite Mountain fire, they did try to reform the miners union, but the company broke it up. And it wouldn't be until the 30s when FDR passed the New Deal and there was federal protection for unions
Right.
that the miners unions would come, the miners would have a union again in Butte. So the carpenters, stuff like that, Teamsters, they all had their unions still in Butte, but the miners for about 15, 16 years did not have any kind of union here in Butte to support them. And so that was probably one of the worst periods for somebody to work in the mines, because you didn't have guaranteed wages. They were still using the rustling card at that time. The rustling card was essentially a little card you got when you got hired on, and you had to turn it in to the company when you went to work for them, and then if they let you go, they'd give it back, and that allowed you to get another job as the miner. Well, the company used it as a way to blacklist guys unofficially, because if you didn't get your rustling card back, you couldn't get work at another mine. So if you did something that made anybody upset in the chain, you lost your rustling card, you weren't getting a job working in the mines. Anywhere.
Wow.
And that's because even though Anaconda technically didn't own every single mine, most of the guys who did own those mines were tied into the company of Anaconda in some way. And so even if Anaconda didn't have direct control, they had indirect control of every mine here in Butte after probably 1895.
That whole period of time really intrigues me with the unions and the work reforms and some of that kind of stuff that were coming about. It seems like it was such a necessary thing at that point in time, and yet it was resisted so vehemently.
Oh yeah, and so it's really interesting too, because in 1911 there was a fire in New York City. It was in a shirtwaist coat factory, and it was a huge fire. Like somewhere upwards of 150 employees died. It was a horrible tragedy, and it was mostly young immigrant women that were working in there. So it was this huge thing, and it actually ended up getting a law passed in Congress for fire safety regulations for those industries.
Right.
So it was this huge win for like the textile industries, but then it didn't really affect other industries. So then this happened in 1911, and then in 1917 we had the Granite Mountain speculator mine fires here in Butte. In our mines, 168 guys got killed in a horrible fire that really could have been prevented if fire safety regulations had been enforced in the mining industry the way they were now being enforced in the textile industry.
Right.
So that's where you see, even with the unions being supportive of some industries, the industries were still being individually taken care of rather than having a uniform, like, hey, we all should have good fire safety regulations. We should all work as a team to make sure we're all protected. The textile industry got what they needed, but it really didn't affect anybody else. And so even though you had a national law get passed because of that fire, it had no effect on
The rest
places,
of the...
places like Butte, where that wouldn't be. There was another fire that happened in, I think, 1914 that wasn't nearly as severe as the Granite Mountain fire, but was still bad enough, and again probably could have been prevented had the regulations that were now being enforced in factories be regulated and enforced in the mines. So the unions, as much as they were really good, they weren't really good about fighting for anybody outside of their specific realm, and that tends to be the case even today.
Right.
The unions will pair up and team up if they're in a similar industry with each other, but if it's something that they need to focus on for them, they focus on them, and they don't really tend to care about what happens to the other guys.
This has been absolutely fascinating. You've done such a fantastic job of explaining so many things. This museum is a fantastic museum, and anybody driving down Interstate 90, if you don't make the turn into Butte, drive up Montana Avenue, look at the architecture, pull on into this museum, you're missing out on a very nice display and very nice museum. Again, you have a website that is
miningmuseum.org, and we also have our Facebook page, which you can find under World Museum of Mining, where we put out information for upcoming events,
Okay.
Stuff like that. Just a quick note on things coming to the museum. We are beginning the work on a military exhibit that's going to showcase the service members themselves. So we want to showcase the guys, the men and women from Butte and Greater Montana that served in the United States Armed Forces. We're looking for donations and help with that exhibit. Anything helps, whether it's uniforms. If you want to help build the exhibit, you want to help donate money, stuff like that. We also have our Mining Heritage Center we're attempting to build, which we walked by our new pavilion.
Is that where all the wall was kind of around? And
So, well, right here that when we came to the church,
we walked past something, and I was going to ask you about it and forgot.
there's this big new metal building right here.
Oh, okay.
And so this is our pavilion, which we just finished. This is the first step in our Mining Heritage Center, which will also include an education center and a new archival building with a new gift shop area. And that we're looking to raise about $10 million to help us get all that built. And
what I was looking at was this brick.
So
Looked like
that's
it was
our
a memorial.
It's our miners' memorial.
Miners'
wall,
memorial.
And it's all the people who were killed in either the mines or the railroads or the different shops that supported the mining industry around Butte.
Okay.
So there's about 2,500 names on that wall. On those
Now, you
walls.
said mining was the third most dangerous industry.
Yep.
Timber, I think, was right up there at
Lumber
number
has
one or
been
two.
Lumber has been number one, to my knowledge, for about 150 years.
And so you had a lot of timber going on here. You had a lot of mining going on here, and I don't know what's the number two, but there had to have been a lot of occupational deaths in this area
so
as a common deal.
Yep. So and out of we started in 1864. The last mine, other than the Continental Pit that currently operates, shut down in 1982. So that's about 118 years, if I'm doing my math correct. And out of 118 years, we had 2,500 guys that were killed in actual accidents. That number does not include guys who died from silicosis.
Wow.
So if you add that in, we're probably talking upwards of 5,000 or more.
That's just unbelievable.
And so yeah, it's a good wall. It's a good memorial to have. Maybe some people can argue it's not enough, but it's what we could do.
Yeah, I was going to say, what else do you do?
Well, I have some thoughts about that, but we'll save that for another day. But the military exhibit actually is going to be right here. And that's one of the things we've got coming, like I said, coming to the museum. We've got events coming up too over the course of the time. And of course, we're not going anywhere, so we hope people join us and come take the tours, the underground tours, the white glove tours as we start to push them out more. And of course, our 22 acres of museum for people to explore.
Oh, and there's so much to see here, and it's so well done. Well, Christopher, I so much appreciate your time today
welcome.
and taking it with us. And as I always finish out my podcasts, I say the world is full of wonder. People need to get out and explore. This is one place and one whole occupation realm that is so fascinating. And everybody have an absolutely wonder-filled day.
All the roll and go, where am I to go? Meet Johnny, where am I to go? For I'm a young and a sailor lad, and where am I to go?